The 7 levels of weirdest weaknesses of DC characters. Level 1. Superman Kryptonite. Kal-El was born on the planet Krypton, a world orbiting a red sun where the native population possessed no superpowers. When Krypton faced imminent destruction, his father Jor-El launched the infant Kal-El toward Earth in an escape pod. Upon arriving on Earth and being adopted by the Kent family in Smallville, Kansas, young Clark began developing extraordinary abilities. Earth's yellow sun radiation interacted with his Kryptonian cellular structure in ways that granted him powers beyond imagination: flight, super strength, invulnerability, heat vision, and more. The biological explanation makes sense. His alien physiology processes solar energy differently than humans, making him essentially a living solar battery powered by Earth's sun. Superman's position as Earth's greatest hero is built on this incredible power, but it comes with a logical weakness tied directly to his origin. Kryptonite, radioactive fragments of his destroyed homeworld, affects him because it's literally pieces of Krypton irradiated during the planet's explosion. When Superman encounters kryptonite, his cells that normally process yellow sun radiation are poisoned by the radioactive signature of his homeworld. It's not arbitrary magic, what it means. It's radiation poisoning affecting an alien biology that wasn't designed to handle its homeworld's irradiated remains. The first major appearance of kryptonite in modern continuity showed how devastating this weakness could be. In various storylines, villains like Lex Luthor have acquired kryptonite and used it to level the playing field against Superman. When exposed to green kryptonite, Superman doesn't just get slightly weaker, he's completely incapacitated, falling to his knees in agony as the radiation burns through his cells. His invulnerability disappears, his strength fades, and prolonged exposure will kill him. The logical nature of this weakness makes it perfect for storytelling because it's consistent and explainable. One memorable moment occurs when Lex Luthor creates a kryptonite ring and wears it constantly, knowing Superman won't come near him. The ring gives Luthor a zone of safety around himself, turning Superman's greatest weakness into a defensive weapon. Another significant storyline involves Batman keeping a kryptonite ring in the Batcave, given to him by Superman himself as insurance. Superman trusts Batman to use it if he's ever mind-controlled or goes rogue, showing that he's aware his power requires checks and that his weakness is the only realistic way to stop him. The brilliance of kryptonite as a weakness is that it scales with Superman's power. Because Superman is nearly invincible under yellow sun radiation, having a weakness that completely negates his abilities creates actual tension in his stories. Without kryptonite, Superman would be too powerful to write compelling conflicts for. The weakness is logical because it's rooted in his origin story, consistent because it always affects him the same way, and necessary because it's the only thing that makes Superman vulnerable. Different colors of kryptonite with different effects add variety. Red kryptonite causes unpredictable transformations. Gold kryptonite permanently removes his powers. Black kryptonite splits him into good and evil versions. But green kryptonite remains the standard, the radioactive reminder that Superman is still alien and still vulnerable to his destroyed world's remains. Level 2. Martian Manhunter, Fire. Johns was born on Mars millions of years ago, part of an advanced telepathic civilization of green Martians. Mars was a thriving world until a psychic plague called Hourman's curse swept through the population, causing telepathic feedback that made Martians experience each other's deaths. The plague was actually bioengineered by John's brother, Ma'alefa'ak, who was born without telepathy and resented his people. The curse manifested as uncontrollable fire visions in Martian minds, causing them to spontaneously combust. John watched his entire civilization burn, including his wife and daughter, leaving him as one of the last surviving Martians. John eventually came to Earth through various origin explanations. Some versions have him accidentally teleported by human experiments, others have him coming deliberately as a refugee. His Martian physiology grants him incredible powers under Earth conditions: shapeshifting, density control allowing intangibility and super strength, telepathy rivaling or exceeding most psychics, flight, regeneration, and near Superman-level durability. The Justice League considers him one of their most powerful members, someone who could theoretically defeat most threats through his combination of physical and mental abilities. His power set makes him extraordinarily versatile and dangerous. But Joan has a crippling weakness to fire that's conditional rather than purely physical. Martians aren't inherently flammable or weak to heat. Their weakness is psychosomatic, burned into their genetic memory by Hourman's curse. The trauma of watching his entire species burn to death while experiencing their terror telepathically created a deep psychological association between fire and death. When Joan sees fire, his Martian physiology responds to the psychological trauma by becoming actually vulnerable to it. His cells that normally regenerate from almost any damage shut down when exposed to flame because his mind believes fire can kill him. This conditional weakness manifests in numerous battles where villains exploit his fire vulnerability. In one Justice League storyline, enemies use flamethrowers against Joan, and he immediately loses cohesion, his shape-shifting abilities failing as he reverts to a more basic Martian form and collapses in panic. His telepathy becomes erratic, broadcasting his terror to nearby minds. Another incident shows him frozen in fear when a building catches fire during a rescue mission. Intellectually, he knows he should save people, but the sight of flames paralyzes him completely. The conditional nature makes this weakness fascinating because John has occasionally overcome it temporarily through intense mental discipline or when protecting others gives him something stronger than his trauma to focus on. In critical moments, he's pushed through burning buildings or endured being set on fire to save innocents, showing that the weakness can be resisted but never eliminated. His brother Ma'alafa'ak returns in various storylines specifically to torture John with fire, knowing it's not just a physical weakness, but a weapon that attacks Joan's deepest trauma. One particularly cruel moment involves John being trapped in a room slowly filling with fire while telepathically connected to his teammates. They experience his overwhelming terror and pain, feeling his psychological breakdown as the fire triggers memories of Mars burning. He's screaming telepathically about his family dying while physically unable to shapeshift through the walls or go intangible to escape. Batman has to talk him through controlling his panic enough to escape, showing that Joan's weakness isn't just fire itself, but the psychological response that makes the fire dangerous. The weakness is conditional because it depends on Joan's psychological state. There are stories where he's been hypnotized or had his memories suppressed, and during those periods, fire doesn't affect him because he doesn't remember why he should fear it. This proves the weakness is mental rather than physical, but it's so deeply embedded in Martian genetics from generations experiencing the curse that it might as well be physical. The tragedy is that John is one of DC's most powerful heroes, capable of incredible feats, but a common campfire can incapacitate him completely because it triggers trauma so deep that his body responds by becoming vulnerable to the thing he fears most. Level 3. Green Lantern, Yellow. The Green Lantern Corps was created billions of years ago by the Guardians of the Universe, ancient beings who sought to bring order to the cosmos. They created the central power battery on their homeworld Oa and forged thousands of power rings, each one a weapon capable of creating constructs from pure willpower. The rings were distributed to selected beings across the universe, forming an intergalactic police force. Each Green Lantern wields their ring by channeling willpower into green energy constructs limited only by imagination and will. The rings can create anything the user can visualize: weapons, shields, tools, vehicles, making Green Lanterns extraordinarily versatile and powerful. The original Green Lantern weakness was completely arbitrary. The rings couldn't affect anything yellow. This limitation was supposedly built into the rings by the Guardians as a necessary flaw, explained through various retcons as being related to the yellow impurity in the central power battery, or later as fear being represented by yellow in the emotional spectrum. The Golden Age Green Lantern. Alan Scott had a different power source and was weak to wood, which made even less sense. But the Silver Age Green Lanterns like Hal Jordan and John Stewart were all vulnerable to yellow, creating bizarre situations where a hero capable of fighting gods could be stopped by a yellow-painted wall. This arbitrary weakness created countless absurd scenarios in Silver Age comics. Criminals would paint their getaway cars yellow, rendering Green Lantern helpless to stop them. Villains wore yellow costumes specifically to exploit this weakness. In one infamous story, Green Lantern struggles against an opponent wielding a yellow lemon. The weakness was so arbitrary that writers constantly had to create contrived situations where yellow objects were conveniently available. Hal Jordan once lost a fight because his opponent threw yellow mustard at him. The limitation made no logical sense. Why would an alien police force create weapons with such an obvious and easily exploitable flaw? Later DC continuity tried to explain the yellow weakness as being psychological rather than absolute. The retcon established that the yellow impurity in the central power battery was actually the fear entity Parallax, imprisoned by the Guardians. Yellow represented fear in the emotional spectrum, and the rings couldn't affect yellow because they couldn't overcome fear without sufficient willpower. This explanation meant that Green Lanterns, with enough willpower, could overcome the yellow weakness, making it less arbitrary. Hal Jordan eventually conquered his ring's yellow limitation through sheer force of will, able to affect yellow objects when sufficiently determined. One storyline shows Hal Jordan fighting against yellow constructs created by Sinestro, who formed his own course wielding yellow fear-powered rings. Hal's ring initially falters against the yellow energy, the constructs slipping through his green barriers. But through intense concentration and willpower, he pushes past the limitation. his green constructs solidifying and clashing against Sinestro's yellow one. The scene shows that overcoming the arbitrary weakness requires mental effort, turning it from absolute immunity to psychological challenge. Still, the fact that yellow was ever a weakness demonstrates the arbitrary nature of Silver Age comic book logic. Modern continuity has essentially eliminated the yellow weakness for experienced Green Lanterns, acknowledging it was an arbitrary limitation that didn't serve the stories well. Current Green Lanterns can affect yellow objects without issue, the weakness existing only as historical curiosity or affecting rookie Lanterns who haven't learned to overcome the psychological barrier. But the legacy remains. For decades, DC's premier space cops were vulnerable to the color yellow, leading to countless ridiculous scenarios where sophisticated aliens with advanced technology couldn't figure out how to paint things green instead. The arbitrary weakness becomes embarrassing in retrospect, a reminder that comic book weaknesses weren't always well thought out and sometimes existed purely because writers needed to create artificial tension in stories about otherwise overpowered characters. Level 4. Aquaman, Dehydration. Arthur Curry was born to a human lighthouse keeper and Atlanta, the queen of Atlantis who had fled to the surface world. His hybrid heritage granted him abilities that seemed impressive, but came with a ridiculous limitation that made him the butt of jokes for decades. Arthur possesses superhuman strength, allowing him to withstand deep ocean pressures, the ability to breathe underwater through gills, communication with marine life through a form of telepathy, and enhanced swimming speed. His Atlantean physiology is adapted for ocean life, making him incredibly formidable in his natural environment. But the ridiculous weakness that plagued Aquaman's character for years was his need to return to water regularly or risk dehydration and death. Different versions of this limitation varied in severity, but the classic interpretation was that Aquaman could only survive out of water for 1 hour before his body would begin shutting down. This meant that during Justice League missions on land, Aquaman was on a timer, constantly aware that he had limited time before he'd become weak and potentially die. For a hero meant to be Earth's defender of the oceans and a member of the Justice League, being unable to spend more than an hour on land was absurdly limiting. This weakness created countless ridiculous scenarios in comics and particularly in pop culture adaptations. The Super Friends cartoon famously showed Aquaman becoming weak and collapsing because he'd been on land too long, requiring his teammates to find water to revive him. Writers struggled with how to include him in land-based missions, often having him stay in bodies of water nearby or requiring contrived situations where the team needed to go underwater so Aquaman would be useful. The weakness made him seem less like a superhero and more like a fish out of water, literally. One particularly ridiculous story showed Aquaman during a Justice League mission in a desert, growing progressively weaker as the hour limit approached. His teammates had to constantly find oases or carry water for him to splash on himself to extend his time limit. Another scenario involved Aquaman in a meeting at the Justice League headquarters, sitting in a water tank because he couldn't participate in normal team activities without constant immersion. These moments were played seriously in the comics but read as unintentionally comical, making Aquaman seem less like a powerful hero and more like a liability. The dehydration weakness became so associated with jokes about Aquaman being useless that DC eventually had to address it. Modern continuity has significantly reduced or eliminated this limitation. Current versions of Aquaman can survive on land indefinitely, though he's still more powerful in water and might experience some discomfort from extended land time. The New 52 and subsequent continuities establish that Arthur is perfectly capable of living on land, having spent much of his youth on the surface with his father. His powers don't require constant water immersion, though he's significantly stronger and faster in ocean environment. The 2018 Aquaman movie completely ignored the 1-hour limitation, showing Arthur spending days on land without issue. This reflects DC's decision to move past the ridiculous weakness that had made the character a joke. Jason Momoa's portrayal emphasized Aquaman's strength, durability, and combat abilities rather than focusing on limitations, but the legacy of the weakness remains. Entire generations know Aquaman as the guy who talks to fish and can't stay out of water for more than an hour, a reputation that required years of serious storylines and modern adaptations to overcome. The ridiculous nature of this weakness is highlighted by comparison to other aquatic heroes who don't share the limitation. Namor, the Submariner in Marvel, can survive on land indefinitely despite having similar powers. DC essentially gave Aquaman a weakness that made him seem less capable than he should be, a limitation that existed primarily to create artificial tension rather than serving any logical purpose. The weakness suggested that Atlantean biology was somehow so fragile that brief surface exposure was life-threatening, despite Arthur being strong enough to throw ships and fight Superman-level threats. It was ridiculous, because it made no sense that someone with his durability would be defeated by something as mundane as staying dry for 61 minutes. Level 5. Wonder Woman, bound by a man. Diana of Themyscira was sculpted from clay by her mother, Queen Hippolyta, and given life by the Greek gods on the hidden island of Themyscira, home to the immortal Amazon. The gods blessed her with gifts that made her one of Earth's most powerful heroes. Demeter granted her super strength, Athena gave her wisdom and combat prowess, Artemis provided hunting skills and communion with animals, Hestia gave her sisterhood with fire, Hermes granted her superhuman speed and flight, and Aphrodite blessed her with beauty and a loving heart. Diana became Wonder Woman when Steve Trevor crashed on Themyscira, and she left to bring peace to man's world. But in her Golden Age origins and early appearances, Wonder Woman had an embarrassing weakness that reflected the troubling gender politics of 1940s comics. If a man bound her bracelets together, she would lose her Amazon strength and become helpless. This limitation was explained as a psychological submission to masculine authority tied to the Amazon's origin as having once been enslaved by men. The weakness was particularly problematic because it specifically required a man to do the binding. Women binding her bracelets had no effect. This created a bizarre power dynamic where the world's most powerful female hero was rendered helpless by male domination symbolically represented through bondage. This embarrassing weakness led to countless stories where villains would simply tie Wonder Woman's bracelets together, and she would become a damsel in distress requiring rescue. The visual imagery was often explicitly bondage-themed, with Wonder Woman tied up in ropes, chains, or held by her bound bracelets while helpless. These stories were written by William Moulton Marston, who had unconventional views about female submission and dominance, and his personal interests heavily influenced these early Wonder Woman comics. The subtext was rarely subtle. Masculine control rendered the powerful Amazon helpless. One particularly embarrassing storyline showed Wonder Woman captured by a villain who bound her bracelets and then paraded her around as his servant. She was shown obeying his commands, her strength gone simply because her bracelets were chained together. The story explicitly framed this as her submitting to male authority, treating it as a psychological weakness rather than a physical one. Modern readers looking back at these stories find them deeply uncomfortable, as they suggest that Wonder Woman's power was contingent on not being dominated by men, and that male control could render her immediately powerless. Another aspect of this weakness was that if Wonder Woman's bracelets were removed entirely, she would enter a berserker rage and become uncontrollably violent. This was framed as the bracelets representing Amazon's self-control, and without them, Diana would lose herself to savage fury. This created a no-win scenario. With her bracelets on but bound, she was helpless. With them off, she was dangerous to everyone, including herself. The ideal state required her to wear the bracelets freely, making them both her symbol of power and her greatest vulnerability to masculine control. DC eventually recognized how problematic this weakness was and quietly phased it out. Modern Wonder Woman comics have completely eliminated the bracelet binding weakness. Her bracelets remain important as virtually indestructible weapons she uses to deflect bullets and energy blasts, but binding them together has no effect on her power. Current continuity treats the Golden Age weakness as outdated 1940s nonsense that doesn't reflect who Wonder Woman actually is. When writers do reference it now, it's typically to explicitly contradict it, showing villains attempting to bind her bracelets and failing because that weakness no longer exists. The embarrassing nature of this weakness goes beyond just being silly or impractical. It reflected and reinforced harmful ideas about gender, power, and control. The notion that the most powerful female hero's strength could be negated by male bondage sent a troubling message. Modern Wonder Woman is written as someone whose power comes from within her, rather than being conditional on avoiding masculine domination. The weakness exists now primarily as historical footnote, an embarrassing reminder of how far superhero comics have come in their portrayal of female characters, and proof that not all Golden Age comic elements deserve preservation in modern continuity. Level 6. Plastic Man, Extreme Cold. Eel. O'Brien was a small-time criminal and safecracker working with a gang of thieves. During a burglary at a chemical plant, the heist went wrong when security guards interrupted them. Eel was shot and fell into a vat of strange chemicals, his body absorbing the experimental compounds. His gang abandoned him, and he crawled away injured and covered in the mysterious liquid. The chemicals fundamentally altered his molecular structure at a cellular level, transforming him into something beyond normal human biology. His entire body became malleable, capable of stretching and reshaping into virtually any form. The incident changed Eel's life in multiple ways. While recovering in a monastery, he had a moral awakening and decided to use his newfound powers for good rather than crime. He became Plastic Man, a hero capable of incredible feats through his elasticity. His powers include stretching his body to extreme lengths, flattening himself paper-thin, inflating himself to enormous sizes, reshaping his body into complex tools and objects, and mimicking other people's appearances. His malleable form makes him nearly invulnerable to physical damage. Bullets pass through him. Blunt force just deforms him temporarily, and even being shattered can be recovered from if his pieces are reassembled. Plastic Man's absurd weakness is that extreme cold makes him brittle and vulnerable to shattering. When his malleable body is frozen, his molecular structure loses its flexibility and becomes rigid like normal plastic exposed to freezing temperatures. In this brittle state, he can be broken into pieces, each fragment retaining some awareness but unable to function independently. The weakness is absurd because it's literally treating him like plastic material rather than living tissue. He responds to temperature the way a plastic toy would, becoming brittle and breakable when frozen, despite being a sentient being with thoughts, feelings, and biological function. This absurd weakness has been exploited in various storylines with disturbing results. In one story, Batman keeps a Plastic Man contingency plan that involves freezing him and shattering him into pieces if he ever goes rogue or is mind-controlled. The pieces are then stored separately to prevent reassembly. This plan treats Plastic Man as an object rather than a person, which is pragmatic from Batman's security perspective but deeply dehumanizing. Another storyline shows villains discovering his cold weakness and using freeze rays to shatter him during combat, forcing his teammates to gather his pieces and thaw him carefully to avoid permanent damage. The most absurd aspect of this weakness is that Plastic Man remains conscious even when frozen and shattered. His pieces retain awareness, meaning he experiences being broken apart while unable to move or speak. One particularly dark story shows him frozen and shattered, his eyes moving in his disconnected headpiece while the rest of him is scattered across the room. He's aware of being in pieces but can't do anything about it, creating a body horror scenario where his consciousness is trapped in fragments of himself. When finally thawed and reassembled, he describes the experience as psychological torture. This weakness becomes even more absurd when you consider that Plastic Man has been shown surviving conditions that should kill any normal human. He's been stretched across miles, compressed to the size of a marble, blown into tiny pieces by explosions and reformed, survived in space and endured countless scenarios that would kill normal heroes. But a cold environment suddenly makes him brittle enough to shatter like cheap plastic. The inconsistency between his incredible durability in most situations and his vulnerability to cold creates a jarring disconnect that makes the weakness feel arbitrary. One storyline attempted to explain the weakness scientifically, suggesting that the chemicals that transformed him created a molecular structure that behaves like synthetic polymers rather than organic tissue. In cold temperatures, the molecular bonds become rigid, losing the flexibility that gives him his powers. This explanation makes the weakness more consistent with material science, but it also emphasizes the absurd reality that Plastic Man is essentially a sentient plastic object wearing human shape. He can think, feel, and act like a person, but his actual physical structure responds to temperature like an inanimate object. The absurdity reaches its peak when considering that this weakness means Plastic Man is effectively useless in cold climates. Missions in Arctic regions, high altitudes, or even air-conditioned buildings potentially put him at risk. Villains with basic freeze rays become major threats to him despite him being able to fight Superman-level enemies in normal conditions. A hero capable of reforming from being blown apart by explosions can be defeated by winter weather, which is so absurd that writers often simply ignore the weakness in modern stories unless they specifically need it for plot purposes, treating it more as an occasional vulnerability than an absolute limitation like it originally was portrayed. Level 7. Hourman, power only lasts 1 hour per day. Rex Tyler was a brilliant chemist working at Bannerman Chemical in the late 1930s, who became obsessed with creating a compound that could enhance human abilities beyond normal limitations. After years of experimentation, he successfully synthesized a drug he called Miraclo, a pill that would grant the user superhuman strength, speed, durability, and enhanced senses. But the formula was inherently unstable. Rex couldn't create a version that lasted longer than 60 minutes before the effects wore off completely. Despite this severe limitation, he decided to use Miraclo to fight crime, becoming Hourman, a hero whose name literally advertised his 1-hour time limit. Rex's origin as Hourman established him as a hero with a built-in weakness that wasn't something that could hurt him, but rather a strict time limit on his usefulness. When he takes a Miraclo pill, he gains powers comparable to other Justice Society members for exactly 60 minutes. During that hour, he's formidable, strong enough to fight supervillains, fast enough to dodge bullets, durable enough to survive explosions. But the moment that hour expires, he's just a normal human again. Even more limiting, he can only take 1 pill per day, meaning he gets 1 hour of superhuman abilities and then must wait 23 hours before he can access his powers again. This inexplicably strange weakness created bizarre scenarios throughout Hourman's comic history. During Justice Society missions, Rex had to carefully consider when to take his Miraclo pill, because using it too early meant his powers might run out during the critical moment of battle. In one story, he took his pill at the mission start, spent 30 minutes traveling to the villain's location, fought for 20 minutes, and then had to retreat for 10 minutes while still in danger because his powers were about to expire. His teammates had to protect him once he became powerless again, making him a liability rather than an asset for most of any given mission. The strangeness of this weakness is compounded by the arbitrary nature of the 1 hour limit and 1 pill per day restriction. Why exactly 60 minutes? Why does the formula break down after exactly 1 hour rather than gradually weakening? Why can't he take 2 pills for 2 hours or half a pill for 30 minutes? The comic never provided satisfying answers to these questions because they were essentially arbitrary limitations designed to make Hourman interesting through restriction rather than power. Unlike other heroes whose weaknesses are external threats, Hourman's weakness is built into his power source itself. One particularly inexplicable storyline dealt with Rex becoming addicted to Miraclo. The formula, being a drug, created psychological and physical dependence. Rex started taking pills more frequently, trying to extend his powered time by taking them closer together, which caused dangerous side effects. His addiction storyline was ahead of its time in addressing substance abuse in superhero comics, but it also highlighted how strange his power source was. He was literally a drug addict whose superhero career required him to carefully manage his addiction. He eventually created a non-addictive version of Miraclo, but the 1 hour limit remained. His son Rick Tyler eventually took over the Hourman mantle and later gained the ability to see 1 hour into the future, adding temporal precognition to the strength and speed granted by Miraclo. This seemed like a clever way to make the 1 hour limitation thematic, an hour of power and an hour of foresight. But even this didn't explain why the limitation existed. A later version of Hourman was an android from the future who traveled back in time and was powered by a time engine that gave him 1 hour of power per day, somehow managing to make the weakness even more inexplicable by tying it to time travel mechanics that were never fully explained. The strangest aspect of Hourman's weakness is that it's self-imposed. Unlike Superman, who can't help being vulnerable to kryptonite, or Martian Manhunter, whose fire weakness is psychological trauma, Rex Tyler chose to become a hero despite knowing his powers were severely time-limited. He could have continued experimenting to create a better formula, or simply not fought crime at all if he couldn't develop reliable powers. Instead, he decided that 1 hour of superpowers per day was enough to justify putting on a costume and fighting crime, accepting a weakness that made him predictably useless 23 hours out of every 24. Modern DC continuity has mostly sidelined Hourman because writers struggle with how to use a hero who's only superpowered for 1 hour per day. In team settings, he's difficult to write because his limitation requires constant attention. Every story has to track how much time he has left, when he last took a pill, whether the current situation justifies using his limited power. The weakness is so inexplicably strange that it actually makes the character narratively inconvenient, which is perhaps the ultimate indicator of a poorly conceived limitation. A weakness should create dramatic tension while remaining manageable for storytelling purposes, but Hourman's time limit is so severe and arbitrary that it often works against dramatic tension, making readers wonder why he doesn't just wait to take his pill until the exact moment he's needed rather than risk wasting his hour traveling to fights or standing around during planning phases. The inexplicably strange weakness reaches its ultimate expression when you realize that Hourman is essentially a hero defined entirely by his limitation rather than his abilities. Ask someone what they know about Hourman, and the answer is always, he has 1 hour of power. The weakness is his entire concept. Unlike Superman, whose kryptonite weakness supports stories about the character, or Green Lantern, whose yellow weakness created specific scenarios, Hourman's 1 hour limitation is the character. He's a walking countdown timer, a hero who exists to demonstrate that even severe, inexplicable limitations can be worked around if you're determined enough, which is inspiring in a way, but also makes him one of the strangest heroes DC ever created because his power is literally defined by how briefly it works before failing completely.